Welcome to today's special episode of the Inspiration Forum's podcast series Screenshot, this time with tech journalist Parix Marx on recent developments in artificial intelligence, how to think about the hype surrounding AI. Are we really witnessing a revolution as the tech companies are trying to tell us? And why do people like Elon Musk or Sam Altman claim that AI is a threat to humanity? Parix and I discussed these issues during the 27th annual Ji.hlava International Documentary Film Festival.
So, obviously I'm speaking about AI today. It's probably a topic that you've heard a little bit about in the past year, with all the media coverage. So I want to start by, telling a little story, right? Imagine a chatbot gets released, journalists go and speak to it and are amazed and publish the transcripts in the newspapers and people get all excited. People have experiences with it, people kind of chat with it, and feel that they're having these really meaningful conversations. On top of that, the creators say that this is a first step toward computers getting close to achieving human-level intelligence. And then, beyond that, some of those creators as well also say, whoa, be careful here. We might be heading toward a space where there could be a really significant threat to the human species because our computers are becoming so powerful, right? Now, you might think, oh, that's ChatGPT. That's what we've been going through for the past almost year. It was November 30th last year. But actually, what I'm talking about is Eliza. And that was a chatbot that was released in 1966, created by the German computer scientist Joseph Weizenbaum. And this was a chatbot that was released, obviously computing was much more rudimentary at the time, was not nearly as powerful as it is today. But when he released this chatbot, there was a very similar response as we're seeing today with ChatGPT. You had journalists from the Boston Globe going to have conversations with it, saying that it was going to change everything. You had people saying that this was the first step toward, computers being able to speak to human beings and all this kind of stuff, right? And Weizenbaum himself at the time was not so much of a critic, but was kind of interested and excited about what these technologies could be. But then as people started kind of having an experience with this chatbot and started speaking to it, and it was developed to kind of mimic and look like a psychiatrist. So you would put in, something that you wanted to say to it, and it was developed to kind of take what you said and turn it back to you as a question, right? To keep asking you to kind of dig deeper on it. It was something very easy to do with the computers at the time, but it made it feel like you were having this conversation and that it was really understanding you and asking you kind of a meaningful response to whatever you were telling it, right? Even though it was not doing that at all. And Weizenbaum had this experience where people would use it, and he tells this specific story where his secretary went to, have a conversation with Eliza, and after, making a few prompts, or submitting a few things into the computer, she asked him to leave the room because she felt that she was having this really kind of meaningful conversation with this computer chatbot that did not have a clue what she was saying, but was just developed to kind of, send these questions back to her. And that turned Weizenbaum into a critic, and we'll kind of get into that a bit more. Now, this guy right here, he's John McCarthy. So in 1956, he coins the term artificial intelligence as an alternative to cybernetics, which was kind of like the big term that you had at the time to describe computers. And in 1958, he launched the Artificial Intelligence Project at MIT, in Massachusetts, with Marvin Minsky. And so the funding for that, they were really trying to develop these systems, again, to show that these computers could develop this kind of greater sense of knowledge, get close to kind of human intelligence. And a lot of the funding for that came from the military because, of course, the Sputnik moment was not long before. The United States was concerned about kind of keeping up technologically with the Soviet Union. And so there was a ton of funding that went into a ton of kind of computational research in order to ensure that the United States kind of stayed ahead, and hoping that these could have implications for military uses and things like that. But his approach, this idea of artificial intelligence contained a particular ideology of computation, right? Someone like Joseph Weizenbaum believed that, maybe we could have computers become more intelligent, but they would never replicate a human because a computer was distinct from a human. It didn't have human experiences. It was not able to kind of develop this ability to kind of reach the type of intelligence, the type of meaning that we have in the thoughts that we have. But someone like John McCarthy or Marvin Minsky, they really believe that, Minsky said that the brain is like a meat machine. If they could just make the computers more powerful, they would be able to replicate basically everything that our brain does. And so this was a real division at the time, and we see this division kind of continue. And so this is a graph. We don't need to go through every little piece of it, but it's just to say, obviously we have this moment right now where there's all this excitement, there's all this hype about AI and what it's going to mean for us. But, you can go back to the 1950s and you see these kind of moments of a lot of excitement, and then the dip down when all the great things that were promised don't come to be. And then we have another of these moments and we dip again. There's all these ups and downs and kind of the excitement around AI and what it's going to mean for us and kind of the transformations that are going to happen. And so obviously, we find ourselves up here. But in just a minute, I want to talk about the kind of last hype moment. So obviously what we see since November of last year is ChatGPT, the big boom in that, all of the excitement. There was this rapid growth in the user base, which is shown from this chart here. You see that ChatGPT reached 1 million users really quickly. The tech folks and the tech media love to point at these sorts of things. I think it's actually kind of a meaningless statistic, because if you think about, there's this software program that's online that anyone can kind of pop onto a website and just try out, and all the media is covering it and saying it's the next big thing and it's huge and it's going to change everything. Of course, people are going to jump onto the website and see what it's all about, right? If it's free, if there's really no barrier to entry there. But of course, it was combined, as this was released, it wasn't just, this new system that people could use. It was going to utterly change everything, right? This was like a new step in computation. This was maybe kind of a new internet, a new changing to like everything that we're used to online. And nothing was going to be the same. And so then, of course, as a result of that hype, all of these companies tried to jump on the bandwagon, of course, right? Because once there's a new thing out there in the tech industry, they all have to do it. And so, Microsoft and Apple and Meta and, all the rest of them were saying, okay, here's our generative AI feature. Here's how we are going to use this. And here's how it's going to kind of transform our businesses and everything that the public does, right? And of course, there are particular people who are really involved with this, who are really kind of pushing this narrative. These are some faces that you might recognize, or maybe you don't. I think the most recognizable one is here on the bottom. But the top here, this is Mark Andreessen. He's a very influential venture capitalist in Silicon Valley. The middle here is Sam Altman. He's the CEO of OpenAI, the creator of ChatGPT. And of course, Elon Musk there at the bottom. So they will claim that AI, think back to John McCarthy, like we were talking about, AI is going to significantly expand human intelligence, right? So these computers are getting more powerful because the computers can replicate human intelligence. Now, all of a sudden, we are going to get so much smarter. And as a result, that is going to kind of make us all, make society so much better, improve the amount of progress, all this kind of stuff. And in particular, one of the things that they talk about is how now there are going to be all these different AI tools, and they're going to be able to help us with everything, and that's going to mean that we can make all this additional progress that we couldn't in the past. It might replace some of the work done by humans, but there will still be a lot more work to be done, and because we're going to have all these AI friends, it's going to make a huge difference to things. Sam Altman, in particular, likes to point out how this could have huge implications for healthcare and education. Right? That we have the shortage of teachers right now. It's going to make it so much easier for people to access education because now we're going to have all these AI chatbots. Or okay, maybe it's difficult for people to access doctors, so now they can just talk to a chatbot and get their diagnosis and all this kind of stuff. I think that's frankly ridiculous. And we've had many kind of examples in the past of technologies being promised to improve education and healthcare and things like that. But what we know is that ultimately having human healthcare workers and having teachers is what makes the real difference there. But of course, you'll probably be familiar with the fact that these people also say, okay, there's all these wonderful, great things that are going to come of like the AI boom and revolution, but there's also this great threat, right? AI could become this general intelligence that is going to become more powerful, more knowledgeable than humans, and then that might be a threat to all of us. They might want to completely destroy us or whatever. So there's all the promise, but there's all the threat as well, and that's used in a very kind of deceptive way, I think, to try to shape regulations and how the public thinks about these things, and to really put our trust in these men over here as they guide us into the AI future. And so what actually made all of this possible, right? As we have this move into generative AI, as ChatGPT kind of takes off, there's a few key developments. So in around 2005, 2006, we start to have the creation of cloud computing, right? Amazon, Google, Microsoft are the big providers here. Big data centers being built all around the world in order to kind of create these cloud computing systems. So having all of that centralized computing power, 2 decades on, is kind of what helps us to have these these larger artificial intelligence systems, generative AI systems, or whatever. We also have massive data collection. So, obviously, these companies are kind of scraping everything off of the web. In order to make ChatGPT, you have an enormous amount of data taken from the web, books that are scraped, all this kind of stuff to train the systems on them. And then you have an enormous amount of capital as well, right? These are very powerful companies. The Microsofts, the Googles of the world, they have a lot of money to put into these sorts of infrastructures that allow them to train these models that, eventually produce kind of the ChatGPTs and things like that. So it's not like this real paradigm shift. It's more like, we've had these kind of incremental developments for the past couple decades and even further that has led us to the point where we can have these systems that can do a bit more than the ones that we had in the past can do, right? But that doesn't mean that they're necessarily, becoming close to human or anything like that. And so when we think about why this kind of AI boom happened in this moment, right? And we think about why there's all this excitement in this moment. I think one thing to understand is that the tech industry always needs something new, right? There needs to be some new technology that they can sell to the public that's going to transform everything, because that drives a new wave of investment. Before the AI boom, you might remember just a couple of years ago, the metaverse was going to change everything. We were going to be living and working and playing all in the digital environment created by Meta, and also cryptocurrencies were going to absolutely transform the financial system, improve everything for the better. We don't hear very much about those things anymore. If you think about Mark Andreessen, who was on the previous slide, he published a great manifesto about how crypto was going to change everything a couple of years ago. He published one more recently about AI, and there wasn't one mention of crypto at all in there. So, at the same time as this was happening, the crypto kind of boom peaked in November of 2021. And then through 2022, we saw a number of kind of collapses and companies going bankrupt, things like that, ending with FTX, with Sam Bankman-Fried. Maybe you've heard of that one. He's on trial right now in the United States. But as that was all happening, we also saw interest rates, in Europe and in North America being raised significantly for the first time in basically over a decade, right? And the tech industry had built this model where it was dependent on low interest rates in order to kind of fund its business model and all these sorts of things. And so it really needed, as these interest rates were going up, as its business model was being threatened, a new way to drive investment kind of into the industry. And that's why we have kind of, the arrival of AI being the next big thing. It's not just a new tool that we can use in, different ways, but it's going to transform everything. It's a threat to all of us, all this kind of exaggerated rhetoric, right? And so, as I said, they needed to drive a new wave of investment. That is kind of why AI comes along. And so as I was showing you in that kind of graph earlier with, kind of the rise and fall of AI through, the past kind of 70 years, the last AI hype cycle, you might remember, was in the 2010s. The mid-2010s, we were seeing a lot of stories about how automation and AI and the robots were going to take our jobs and all these sorts of things, right? How are we going to survive when the robots took all our jobs? Are we going to need a basic income so people aren't destitute as a result of that? We saw these sorts of headlines, in the North American and European press about how robots were going to take almost half of all jobs in the next couple of decades. Robots were going to be flipping our burgers. Robots were going to be driving trucks and driving taxis and all this sort of stuff. And, drivers were not going to have jobs anymore. What are they going to do? How are we going to respond to this? Even little robots were going to do elder care and be our teachers and all these sorts of things, right? All this stuff was going to happen not too long into the future. And then, of course, It didn't really happen, right? What we see is that the tech in that moment, as we were being threatened with these robots rolling out everywhere, it didn't really work out as planned. Certainly, there were developments. Certainly, some things were rolled out, but it wasn't nearly to the scale and the degree that the tech industry was trying to make us believe. What we actually saw in the United States is that, and of course we saw this in Europe as well, was that productivity growth. If we're going to have all this investment in automation, in new technologies, in businesses, and all this sort of stuff, you'd imagine that productivity is going to rise significantly, but actually the 2010s was significantly lower productivity than even we've seen in previous decades. So that really didn't happen, right? Instead, what we saw was new technologies were rolled out, but they weren't used to eradicate work. They were used to reduce the power that workers have in the workplace, right? So, the gig economy, Uber is the obvious example of this. Uber is created in 2008 or 9, of course, right as, we're having the Great Recession, the financial crash, whatever you want to call it. Different places call it different things. And companies like this took advantage of that in order to, create a new labor model and remake the labor model. So instead of having employees who have rights and all this sort of stuff as they're doing this sort of work, now they're contractors, right? They're working on these apps. Their manager is an algorithm, and they can't go directly to a person if they have an issue with how their job, how their employment is working out, right? Maybe you can call into a call center, but no one really cares when you do that, and you can get deactivated at any moment. And so there's very little kind of power or recourse that you have in kind of working for one of these apps. And that's kind of a transformation that comes along as work is kind of remade in this way. And it begins with the apps, of course, but then is rolled out even further beyond that. And Amazon is, a much more clear example, right? They have employees, of course. The warehouse workers are employees at Amazon. But at least in North America, I'm sure it's the case in Europe as well, warehousing work, logistics work is traditional unionized work, right? Where you can make a decent wage in order to do those sorts of things. At Amazon, that's not the case. It's non-union, at least in North America, where they fight unions very aggressively. They make sure that the wages are significantly lower than other workers who would be working in those industries. And they've been able to roll that out as they have expanded beyond warehouses and created their own delivery service. You see a photo of that over there. In that case, the postal carriers, UPS, these are traditionally unionized workplaces as well, where people make good livings. In the case of Amazon's delivery service, again, they're non-union. They contract with local delivery companies, so they're not employed directly by Amazon. They make sure that they're paid far less. They put really high productivity targets on people, so we see that injuries are higher, at Amazon warehouses and in their delivery service and other companies doing the same sorts of work. And of course, they're also kind of managed with an algorithm and all this sort of stuff. So we see this real transformation of labor that happens in that point, the transformation in these workplaces. And it's not, so robots don't take the jobs, but robots and algorithms and kind of algorithmic management and surveillance are rolled out in these ways that do transform what happens in the workplace, but it's not in the way that kind of, the narratives and things suggested. So what we really have is algorithmic management, not robots taking jobs. And that's really significant to understand, I think, especially as we have this new wave of AI that's taking place at this moment. So when we look at something like ChatGPT, we can see that, the way it's often promoted is, okay, you're opening up this website, you're kind of pinning some things into it. It seems like the computer is just responding all on its own. There's no kind of humans in the equation at all. The reality is actually there is a lot of humans in the equation. They're being paid very poorly. They're often located in the global south and places like that. And so, there was reporting that was done by Time magazine that showed OpenAI, which of course is the creator of ChatGPT, was using Kenyan contract workers that were paid as little or less than $2 US an hour in order to do this kind of work to weed things out of the system. So as I was telling you earlier, ChatGPT and these systems are trained by scraping a ton of data off of the web. And as I'm sure you know, there's some pretty terrible stuff on the web if you want to go and find it. So they wanted to make sure that when you put your prompts into ChatGPT, it doesn't spit that stuff back out at you, right? And so they had to hire people in order to train that out of the system. And so these Kenyan workers had to read, I won't read it out, you can read it if you want, some of the absolutely most disgusting things that you can absolutely imagine on the web. And they would have to do this for 8, 10, 12 hours a day. And they reported as a result that the company didn't provide them with mental health supports, so they had to experience all of these things. They didn't get support from the company. Once the work was done, they were laid off. The company didn't want anything else to do with them. And they reported that, as a result of reading these things and kind of engaging with these things for such a long period of time, that they had serious mental health consequences, that it affected their relationships to the people that they know. American media has gone back and spoken to workers who've done these sorts of things, the Wall Street Journal and places like that. And kind of the stories that these workers tell after having to kind of read these sorts of things is really shocking. But it's not just Kenyan workers who do this, right? We see in China where they are also developing their own generative AI tools. Over there, they're using student interns in order to do this sort of work. In Finland, of course, they don't really have the low-wage workers there, so instead they use prison labor in order to do this stuff. I'm sure that happens in other countries as well. And even beyond that, there's a much bigger kind of industry out there of click work, on platforms like Clickworker or Amazon's Mechanical Turk, where people are paid literal pennies in order to label data, in order to do this kind of stuff where they do content moderation and they check the systems of these major companies. But again, they're hidden, right? They're hidden from view. The companies don't want you to know that they exist, but they're absolutely essential to the business model. And then, of course, with all of that, there's serious environmental implications. When we use the web, when we use these generative AI tools, it seems like we're just, interacting with something ethereal, right? It's just out there. We pin in our prompts, we do our searches and whatever, and that's it. But as I was saying, there's these massive data centers around the world that are absolutely essential for that to happen. They require a lot of kind of computer hardware that needs to be constantly recycled out because these servers are consistently running all the time. They're very energy intensive. We see around the world that there are countries and areas where these things are located that are increasingly pushing back on the fact that, they do need to provide so much energy to have these data centers be running. Very water intensive. Places like Chile and the American South, people are fighting back against that because it's using up their fresh water. And of course, then, with all that computer hardware, it also becomes waste, right? And we don't have the proper kind of recycling infrastructures to take care of that. So coming back to ChatGPT and generative AI and the things that we've been kind of considering, the big question is this really intelligent? And it goes back to what we were talking about with Joseph Weizenbaum and John McCarthy back in the 50s and the 60s, right? This is Emily Bender. She is a computational linguist at the University of Washington. And she basically talks about this concept of generative AI as a stochastic parrot, right? If you think about a parrot, you can say things to it, it might repeat some words back to you, but it doesn't really understand those words, right? It's not really having a conversation with you. Maybe there's some degree of like parrot intelligence, but it's not human intelligence, right? It's distinct from that. It's not to the same level. It's not understanding that language. And she argues that when we engage with these AI chatbots and things, that's more so what we're getting, right? It looks like they are understanding us. It looks like they're responding to us, but that's not really the case, right? The science fiction author Ted Chiang basically calls it autocomplete on steroids, right? You type words into your phone and it suggests future words or kind of different spellings and things like that. He says it's like that, but just more powerful, right? It's not really understanding the core of what's going on there. Whereas Sam Altman, of course, who we've talked about, the CEO of OpenAI, says, no, actually, these computers are getting closer and closer to human intelligence. This is possible to achieve. And once we do, that's a generative intelligence a general intelligence that could be really significant, or it could be a real threat, right? He even tweeted after, you see 4th December 2022, a few days after ChatGPT was released, he said, I am a stochastic parrot, and so are you, making a direct reference to what Emily Bender kind of writes about and talks about, basically saying, we're all computational systems. Our brains are computers. We just need the ones on the computers to become more powerful, right? Again, directly back to John McCarthy. So what we see with ChatGPT right now is this kind of boom that we've been experiencing over the past year has really been stalling out. Around March, April of 2023, we've started to see user numbers kind of drop off. This is in the US, this is globally. We also see that the market is also speaking and kind of suggesting that the bubble is already kind of deflating. Morgan Stanley says that the bubble is nearing its peak in August. We see a lot of money flowing out from Taiwanese stocks, and of course Taiwan's really important because a lot of the chip manufacturing occurs there at TSMC. So there was a big inflow as the boom with AI began, and now we see an outflow as of September, as of last month. And so as we kind of wrap this up, I want to talk about this quote from Ursula K. Le Guin. As I was thinking about AI and as I was going through these things, I came across this quote from a speech that she gave when she was given the National Book Award in the United States in 2014. She said, "Hard times are coming when we'll be wanting the voices of writers who can see alternatives to how we live now, can see through our fear-stricken society and its obsessive technologies to other ways of being, and even imagine real grounds for hope. We'll need writers who can remember freedom, poets, visionaries, realists of a larger reality." And of course, when we think about these AI tools, they are not thinking. They are not creating anything new. They are trained off of all this information that's out there on the web, all these books that they've scraped. They're recycling it and they're throwing it back out at us, right? They're creating kind of mashups and generations of all these things that exist, but they do not have the capacity to create anything new. It's really kind of art for commercial purposes rather than kind of human flourishing and kind of enriching the human experience, right? If you think about these companies that create kind of the big films and things like that we consume, art itself has a lot of, if you think about kind of like exchange value versus use value, right? There's a lot of use value in art that cannot be commoditized or that cannot be kind of captured by capitalist metrics, right? The exchange value, what it can be sold for, things like that. And so these systems, they create art for the exchange value, right? They create more and more things that can be sold, that can be consumed. But is that really what's best for us as humans as we think about art that kind of makes us think about the world, makes us consider different things? And what we see recently is that, the writers in Hollywood have been fighting back against AI and some other kind of ways that technology has been used against them. They recently signed a new contract, but the actors are still fighting. And one of the things that they're concerned about is AI as well. So finally, what do we use AI for? This is Joseph Weizenbaum. Again, he's older in this photo than the earlier photo I showed you. In 1976, he wrote a book called Computer Power and Human Reason, where he said that there's a distinction between judgment and calculation. Judgment requires values, requires human values that are created based on the experiences that we have in the world. And those experiences, as we grow up as a human and have this human experience, is what shapes how we understand the world, how we respond to things, how we develop these values. Computers are not human, so they cannot have those experiences. They cannot develop those values. And that's really key for us to understand as we think about how these tools should be used. Computers can be used for computation, right? They're developed for those sorts of things. They can take a large set of numbers and they can kind of do the maths on them and all those sorts of things. That's what they're made for, but they're not made for judgment. When it comes to thinking about, how we think about humans, whether we should judge humans, should we really be using computers? Should we really be using AI tools for those sorts of things? There's a risk, of course, that these tools are rolled out into the world. We know that they don't have these human values. We know that they can't really judge humans in this way, but people in power say, this is an AI tool, this is a computer, this is what they have decided. They've taken in all this data and they've produced this result where they've decided that, you should lose your access to welfare or social support benefits, or you should not be granted this visa, or whatever number of other things that they could be used to decide, right? And it's not so much that the computer knows better than the human, but it's the human kind of shirking responsibility and saying, I haven't made this decision, the computer has made the decision. So even though it's a terrible thing that makes people's lives worse, it's acceptable, right? Because the computer decided it. And we already see this happening. In Australia, they had a scandal called the robo-debt scandal, where they added an AI system to their welfare and social support system that basically judged people's income and said, oh, you're making too much money than you should be to be on social support, so we're kicking you off, we're cutting off your access to benefits. It turned out that AI system was flawed. It was not set up in the right way. And as a result, thousands of people lost their access to these benefits and this income that was absolutely essential to them. It made their lives a living hell, and they were forced to prove that they should actually still get those benefits instead of the government and the system having to prove that they took away their benefits for the right reasons. It was a massive scandal. The government eventually, after 5 years, had to pay $1.8 billion in compensation. But as a result, in that period of time, a lot of people were really negatively affected, and people committed suicide and stuff as a result of that, as a result of the use of that computer system. We see, in the Netherlands, there have been risks about them using algorithms in the social support system for similar reasons. Also using that in the immigration system, so choosing who gets visas and who doesn't, using these very discriminatory algorithms. Of course, in Canada, where I'm from, they're rolling out similar AI tools in the immigration system that have very similar risks. And it's not just in these countries, it's many others doing the same thing. So the ultimate question that we need to ask is, what can AI do? Right? If we think about these systems, if we think about their actual capabilities, should we be distracted by what the Mark Andreessens, the Sam Altmans, the Elon Musks of the world tell us that these AI tools can do? Or should we look very clearly at what they can actually generate and produce, instead of buying into these kind of hype-filled narratives that are designed to drive investment into this sector? And then once we understand what they're capable of properly, we need to ask, what should AI do? Should they be used for anything that they're capable of? Or should we restrict them, thinking about judgment versus calculation, to only the things that we think are acceptable for a computer or an AI system to do, rather than what they might theoretically be capable of? Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. That was an amazing presentation.
Thank you.
And, let's start. Let's talk about the bad things first.
Sure.
So, you had this amazing quote there by Ursula Le Guin.
Mm-hmm.
She basically said that we should imagine some better futures, some alternative futures. But we will get to this at the end of the discussion. But let's stick to this current future. Yep. Because these leaders of Silicon Valley, they are proposing a certain type of future. I mean, they say the AI will change everything. The AI will replace this kind of worker and that kind of worker. Yeah. It will help to do this and that. And there is some vision of future behind it. And do we actually know what kind of future they propose? Because recently there has been this new biography of Elon Musk. Mark Andreessen published his Techno-Optimist Manifesto and so on. Yeah. So what are they trying to achieve? Sure, profit. That's but apart from this, what is their vision of future?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, right? And it's important to understand, because ultimately their vision of the future and their vision for how we get there is that technology is the means through which we improve society. And we can all think about the fact very clearly that technologies have been implemented in our societies in ways that have very clearly made advancements and have made our lives better, right? There's no questioning that. But the question is, when we think about these, very powerful people in Silicon Valley and the future that they're trying to realize, they basically say, give us the power to decide what technologies we should be developing, which technologies we should be rolling out, and who those technologies should ultimately be serving. Because they say that it's just the development of new technologies that makes things better for people, not thinking about how those technologies actually interact with the society that we live in, the political systems that we engage through, not having democratic representatives deciding how these technologies should actually be used, and whether these technologies are ultimately benefiting us at the end of the day. I think it's important to understand one of the things that these Silicon Valley billionaires rely on is this idea that a lot of us have that technology is intimately linked to progress, and that technology only develops in one way, right? So the question is, how fast is technology developing or how slow, not how is technology developing and in which direction. And so Silicon Valley, because they are driven by particular economic incentives, by there are particular drivers that are in that model of technological development. They pursue particular technologies because that is ultimately what benefits them, what benefits their business model, what benefits the people that are at the top of this industry. It's not necessarily the case that those technologies are the technologies that would benefit the broader public. And so I think that we need to be able to have a greater conversation about the types of technologies that we adopt, the types of technologies that are rolled out into the world, but also how we fund technological development and kind of what the ultimate goal is when we think about the new technologies that are being developed and deployed. Because I would argue that a lot of what we get out of Silicon Valley is certainly designed to increase the amount of surveillance that happens through the internet and things like that, that increases the amount of data that is captured on all of us, that encourages us to kind of use digital services instead of kind of having human interaction, because that is ultimately what benefits these companies. And there's a bigger question there as to whether that is ultimately the type of society that we want to realize, or whether we want to use technology for different goals, but that would require rethinking, the ultimate way that we develop this technology, that we think about technology, and all these sorts of huge questions.
If we talk a little bit more about this language they use, because I think before we actually discuss AI, like we should discuss it, we should somehow improve the language, because there is something hidden behind language. You already mentioned this, that when you say AI is replacing workers or replacing management, it sounds like there is some autonomous being, this intelligent thing, which is doing this thing. But it's not true. It is a technology which is applied in some way. And this term artificial intelligence was created in 1950s under certain circumstances, but this is still being repeated and repeated and repeated again and again, while it is neither artificial, because it is created by humans, run by humans, and it's dependent on humans, and it's not that intelligent as well. But in the mainstream discourse, terms like large language models or image generators or text generators are not being used that much. Instead, we are still saying artificial intelligence, artificial intelligence. Why? Why are we repeating this very confusing term again and again?
Yeah, I would say because the tech industry is very skilled at getting us to adopt this language, right? When you go back to the 1950s and you kind of see what John McCarthy was saying, he was basically talking about artificial intelligence, not so much as a descriptive term of kind of what they were able to achieve at the time, but kind of something that was forward-looking, right? That they were hoping to achieve. And now, when you think about it being rolled out today, there is kind of a particular assumption that is kind of embedded in that term, right? The idea that this technology that we're engaging with is intelligent. It's a different form of intelligence, maybe, or it's a different way of kind of achieving intelligence. It makes us believe those things as we kind of continually use those terms. And the tech industry is very skilled at that, right? Think about the fact that we have a smartphone that we're using, right? The kind of assumption there is that it's smart, right? That it is intelligent, that it kind of contains this in it. Or we have a smart watch, or increasingly they have kind of smart refrigerators and washing machines and microwaves and all this kind of stuff. And it's only smart because smart means that it's connected to the internet. But if you say internet connected phone or something like that, it doesn't sound as fancy or as sexy as saying it's a smart phone or a smart watch or something like that. But it makes us think about these products in a particular way, right? And there's a reason why these companies pay PR departments a lot of money in order to develop these sorts of things. I think that one, at least in English, and I don't know how this has kind of progressed in Czech, but if you think about kind of Uber and these kind of apps that allow you to engage with these services in this kind of particular way, whether it's ride hailing, food delivery. In English, they were initially called the sharing economy apps, right? And the idea was that, we were all kind of sharing because these apps were allowing us to kind of, I don't know. I can't even remember their initial argument because it was so ridiculous. But we were sharing our cars and our rides, and now we were just making a little bit of money off of it and all this kind of stuff, right? And then after a few years, the language changed because it became so clear that that was so ridiculous and not what was actually happening there. And now the way that those are commonly referred to are gig economy apps, right? Recognizing the type of work that is actually occurring there. It's not a job, it's a gig. It's an informal work arrangement that does not have this kind of formal labor contract, and that we, I think, are increasingly recognizing was probably not the right way to let these companies kind of reshape what was happening there. But because they can shape our language and the way that we talk about it, and thus the way that we think about it, it allows them to more easily kind of get away with having us adopt their way of thinking about these technologies and these business models, instead of really questioning them earlier on in kind of the cycle, when we could more easily shape the way that they're rolled out or decide whether they're rolled out at all. And I think that we are seeing a bit more of that. Like, I would say, in the aftermath of the financial crash in 2008, 2009, there was a lot more willingness and openness to kind of accepting whatever the tech industry was rolling out. And I think that increasingly what we see is that as these companies are rolling out new technologies and new business models now, immediately, you see from the European Union and European governments and things like that, immediately there's kind of this recognition that, hold on, there might be a downside here. Maybe we should be looking at regulation. We can debate whether the regulations are the right regulations, but at least there's that kind of immediate awareness that really wasn't there as much before.
Yeah, sure. I mean, when you mentioned the gig economy, there's a strong narrative connected to the gig economy, or the so-called gig economy, and that is the narrative of freedom and emancipation. That's a very powerful narrative that the tech industry is using, and technologies were made into a symbol of freedom. And in your book about the history and the future of transportation, you used an amazing example, and that is cars. Because cars became a symbol of freedom, while they definitely don't bring you freedom. So, can you elaborate on this a little bit? How that situation even arose?
Yeah. It's really fascinating. Like, when you look back at the history of the automobile and kind of its emergence in North America and Europe, as I kind of did in the book. But, I focus more on North America because that's where I'm from, of course. But even, obviously you have these really strong narratives about the automobile and it giving you a form of freedom, because all of a sudden, you're not tied to the train system or, the tram system or whatever. You can get in this vehicle and it can bring you anywhere, and you can choose where you're going, and you can see kind of these strong associations that, the auto companies kind of created with the automobile. And then when you see the personal computer start to emerge in the 1970s and 1980s, Apple is like directly kind of tying it to that, and saying that their kind of Apple personal computers are, the Volkswagen of, kind of computation and stuff, right? Because it gives you the freedom, and you can kind of take control of this all on your own. The power of computation is like in your hands now, not in the hands of these like large enterprises and all this kind of stuff, right? So it's fascinating to see those kind of relationships. But even then, when we look at the automobile, certainly there was this kind of number of decades where, we were really kind of buying into these ideas about it. But I think increasingly, we have these recognitions that the automobile and kind of mass reliance on the automobile has had these consequences for, the climate more broadly, as the emissions from these things, are helping to change our climate and weather systems and whatnot. But, while it certainly allows you to kind of go to these various places, there's also a lot of drawbacks that come with being dependent on the automobile, especially, as you see in North America, and I'm sure some parts of the Czech Republic, there are fewer kind of options to get around in other ways. So you become dependent on the automobile. There's no other way to get around. You have to own a car if you are kind of, if you hope to really get access to opportunities and, the types of things that you want to be able to have access to in your life. And then you need to pay the cost of buying the car. And then you need to pay the interest that comes with kind of financing it. And then you need to pay for the maintenance that needs to happen. And then you need to pay for your gasoline. And then, there's all these kind of additional costs that come along with it, right? So that it appears like freedom, but actually there's kind of this whole range of corporate entities that are kind of finding a way to kind of take a cut and make some profit off of the fact that you have to own this particular product. And now, of course, we see the tech industry moving in where, we're putting more technologies. We're connecting our cars to the internet. That's allowing them to collect a ton of data. They're hoping to roll out more subscription services into cars so that they can kind of create these ongoing revenue streams that you see from so many other kind of forms of technology. And so, you see that. And then the question is, what would a real form of kind of freedom look like if we were thinking about that? Would it be to have us all dependent on cars, or would it be to invest much more greatly in good train systems and public transportation systems and all these sorts of things? And then if we're thinking about technology, what would be the ways that we try to have technology that better serves kind of the public rather than just the business models of these major companies? It not only requires us to think critically about what the companies are doing and try to regulate them, but then what are the alternatives, and how do we structure kind of technological funding and technological adoption in such a way that we kind of create these technologies that are more beneficial to the broader public, rather than first serving the kind of desires and the incentives of the tech companies, and then later thinking about how these are going to be kind of reframed or kind of benefit the public, or at least kind of sell an idea of how the public is benefiting, so that you can kind of get the wider adoption.
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly some values being designed into the technology, and because these technologies are not neutral. And at the end of your presentation, you said that there is something that AI do, and then we should ask ourselves what AI should do. And right now, we can already see many examples of some technology that was developed for maximizing profit or mining data, like social networks and so on. And of course, we can use these technologies for good. We can organize citizen activism on Facebook or something like this. But it's not ideal, because that technology was not developed for that purpose. Isn't it the same case with AI? Because, for example, if we speak about some specific examples, when we look at the image generators like Midjourney and others, of course, it could be used for public good. But generally speaking, that was created only to exploit human labor or artist labor. So, are there some really neutral or AI technologies, or all of them basically bent into this profit-making direction?
It's a difficult question, right? Because I think it does require a lot more nuance than we often have in these kind of conversations about AI and digital technologies and things like that, right? To think about what is the ultimate impact of one of these technologies, what impact are they having on the world, and then kind of what is the net impact, right? If they're having some kind of positive outcomes, if they're having some negative outcomes, how do we kind of add up what is acceptable and what is not? And if we're seeing negative outcomes, are there ways that we can kind of regulate or take actions to kind of rein those things in? Or are they more kind of inherent to the technology and they're going to be there all the time? And then are we okay with accepting those things as part of the trade-off of having the technology be present more generally, right? And I think that one of the things that we see time and again with these technologies is that the tech companies roll them out and they say, it's going to have all these kind of fantastic, outcomes for society, and it's going to empower you in all these ways. It's going to give you freedom, whatever. And then kind of 2, 3, 4 years down the line, once they've become entrenched, the drawbacks of those technologies start to become much more present and much more visible. And all of a sudden we're kind of talking about, there need to be regulations on these things. How are we going to respond to the drawbacks that have arisen as a result of our adoption of these things? And often it's too late, because they have already become entrenched, and it's much more difficult to roll them back at that point. If we're to think about how we want technologies to kind of benefit the broader public, these discussions need to happen much earlier, which is why I'm kind of heartened that, with the rollout of AI, immediately there were these questions as to what are the impacts going to be? What is this actually going to mean for people? Do we need to regulate? Again, were the proposals for regulations the best things? Maybe not, maybe we could discuss what the better ways to approach it would have been. But I think that we're kind of moving in the right direction in that way of thinking about this. But there's still a lot more to be done, ultimately.
You mentioned regulations, and I think it all comes down to the question of control. Because these technologies are still controlled by someone. And these are actually controlled by very few companies, like 4 or 5, if we speak about AI, because as you explained, it takes a lot of computing power, a lot of data, and a lot of investment to successfully run such technology. So there is some sort of a oligopoly or monopoly in there. And sure, if we regulate the companies, they can behave a little bit nicer, but still the basis of control doesn't change at all, because that technology is owned by someone and designed for some purpose. Now, and actually originally, as you explained, these technologies were actually created by public funding, either by army or state or universities, and they have been basically hijacked for private purposes. Is there some way out of it? How to rearrange this basis of control?
It's an important question, right? Because it's really at the foundation of kind of what we've been talking about. And, what we see in the United States, I'm not sure the degree to which it's the same in Europe, but a lot of the funding for this sort of development now comes from the military, right? From this kind of basic, more foundational research that happens. Obviously, the tech companies are doing their own kind of research and, rolling out their various products and whatnot. But often they are not doing the more kind of foundational, more basic research, right? They're taking that's done in universities funded by the public sector and then kind of commercializing it, acquiring kind of early startup companies that come out of universities and bringing those into, their bigger companies and then kind of rolling those products into the services and whatnot that they already offer, right? They are not doing a ton of kind of the basic research that's really essential for that, kind of development or progress or whatever we want to call it. But right now in the United States, a lot of that funding comes from the military because, if you're at all familiar with the American political system, there have been a lot of massive cuts to, the government, to the bureaucracy, to public programs in the United States, but the military has been kind of maintained, has been free from those cuts. Its budget has actually increased significantly over the past couple of decades. And so it has the resources to still deploy this kind of funding, whereas other agencies don't have that to the same degree, right? I know there's more kind of civilian funding or whatever in Europe than there is in North America. But I think that we also run into a problem where even when this funding kind of comes from the public sector and is encouraging these types of kind of more basic research to be done, there has been a real change in the incentive structure behind it over the past number of decades, both in Europe and North America, where the goal for universities is to develop a technology that can then be commercialized, kind of moved into the private sector, turned into a startup, and then maybe it grows or it gets acquired or whatever. But there's always that kind of commercial imperative that goes along with the work and the funding and the development that happens. It can't just be kind of work and research for the sake of it. There's a much greater kind of push for commercialization that happens there. And that ultimately has consequences for shaping the types of technologies, the type of research, the type of things that get funded and then ultimately get done. Because, I'm sure that there are a bunch of things that would be great for society, but are ultimately not incredibly profitable, can't easily be commercialized and whatnot. And if you kind of go back and read the history of technological development, kind of as I've been doing the past few years, as I've been doing this work more and more, you can very clearly see how there are kind of different paths that the path of technological development could have gone on. And the way that resources are deployed and kind of the incentives behind them often pushes us in the direction where technology needs to serve profit and needs to serve kind of corporate and state control, right? And time and again, you can see technologies that are developed that would give more power to workers in the workplace, but those things do not get the resources so that they can be able to continue because, the kind of broader incentive structure is not set up in such a way to encourage that, right? Yeah,
maybe a last question before I open the discussion for your questions, because I'm sure there's going to be plenty of questions. You mentioned that there are these bubbles just going on. First it was crypto, then NFTs, then metaverse. Now it's AI. But I think there's a difference because when we look at these numbers of early adopters, ChatGPT was extremely successful, and people are obviously fascinated by AI. There's a difference because, I mean, NFTs or crypto, from the very beginning, it was obvious that it is a grift, it is a financial speculation. But
to you, maybe, not to everybody.
Yeah. But sure. But a few people were so gullible. I mean, many people lost money in there, but still, it was fairly obvious that something is fishy in there. But AI is different. Why? Why are people so fascinated by this technology, even when there are obvious limitations in there?
Totally. I think a few reasons, right? I think first of all, as I was saying, when I was talking about those kind of ChatGPT adoption numbers, it was much easier to access ChatGPT than it was to sign up for a crypto wallet and buy cryptocurrencies and all this kind of stuff, right? Or even to get into the metaverse, right? You needed to buy this headset that was going to cost you a few $100s before you could really kind of get online or try this kind of stuff. And it wasn't very compelling anyway, so, why would you? With AI, it's much more accessible. The kind of potential benefits that come from it that you can get from using it are much more immediate, right? Help you write something, help you kind of experiment with various images or whatever as you're trying to think something up. You can very clearly see that there are ways that this can be used. And it's not to say, when we talk about kind of how this stuff is driven by hype and kind of these bubbles happen, it's not to say that there's never any use for the actual technologies that are underlying those bubbles, but that the tech industry kind of relies on the fact that they are exaggerating and hyping up what is actually being done to make you believe that there's much more there to it, instead of just kind of very clearly discussing and talking about what they see as kind of the pros and cons of the technology, right? They need to sell it not just to the public, but to investors as well, to get them excited, to get this kind of big increase in the share price and kind of the company value and all this sort of stuff. Because if you think about it, someone like Marc Andreessen, who's a venture capitalist, the whole model, and this goes back to the dot-com boom in the late 90s and early 2000s, it crashed in 2000. Basically what happened is the internet was privatized in 1995. You had this big wave of companies and this big wave of investment as everyone tried to kind of go online and commercialize this kind of nascent, online environment. And so a lot of companies were founded, a lot of kind of useless companies were founded, but they still got money because all these investors were hoping that they were going to make a ton of money in this new kind of economic sector. And then, the kind of value of these companies, their share prices, all this stuff really soared right up until the early 2000s when the whole thing crashed. And in that moment, there was a lot of people who lost a lot of money, but there was also a lot of people who made a lot of money because they realized the right moment to get out, right? And so they got out at the top of that peak before it crashed. And so what the tech industry kind of learned from that is not to never create a dot-com boom and bust again, but to keep creating cycles of boom and bust as long as you can identify where the top of that boom is going to be so you can get out and make your money before it crashes. And so someone like Marc Andreessen made a ton of money on crypto, even though there was never much tangible use case there, because he was able to hype it up. He was able to get people to believe in it. And then his venture capital firm was able to get out while it was still high, and kind of put the losses on to other people and other investors and things like that. And so that is kind of what you see time and again. And so it's not to say that there aren't any uses for AI and we shouldn't consider how they might be used, but that the narratives that these companies are using are designed so that we think that, the potential use cases are much greater, so that there's a lot more excitement, so that there's a lot more investment, so that the value shoots up really quickly, so that these venture capitalists and people like that can cash out before it crashes and they find the new technological hype thing to, keep going a year or two later.
Yeah, speaking of this, there is one more different thing about this discussion about AI. Because sure, the tech leaders are promoting the technology. They are creating excitement. They say that AI is going to change everything. You are going to make a lot of money because of it and so on. But there's one different thing. Many of them are absolutely obsessed with this idea of AI apocalypse, that the AI is going to create the end of the world and kill us all, which is very strange that they are creating this fear around their own technology. why are they doing this? There's also some reason behind it.
Yeah, there's definitely a reason behind it. And, if you look at Mark Andreessen, the venture capitalist, and kind of what he puts out, he thinks that he very clearly says, don't believe any of that. AI is all positive. It's going to have all these AI helpers. Everything is good, right? Because his incentive is to kind of drive up the value, drive up the investment, get the hype going so that he can try to cash out. But then you have like the Elon Musks and the Sam Altmans of the world saying AI is amazing, but also it could kill us all. And that's kind of designed, I would argue, to get the public, but more so kind of regulators and lawmakers, to believe in them to present the solutions to how we address this kind of theoretical crisis that they are putting out into the world, right? So if you think about the types of regulations that, say, the EU or the United States have proposed pursuing around AI, they're very much guided by the ideas and kind of the philosophies of these people who are developing the technologies and talking about kind of the greater risks that it can pose. Because when your focus is on, the potential for AI to eradicate humanity or to enslave us or whatever, the types of problems that you perceive AI to potentially cause are very different than if you say AI is currently being used for discriminatory purposes, to cut people off from benefits, to ensure that they can't get visas when they're trying to move to different countries. So there's two different kind of ways of looking at it. And if the focus is, the big scary future that AI might bring where we're all enslaved to it, then it kind of forces you to look away from the actual immediate concerns that we should be paying much more attention to and be regulating and addressing right now, but that these companies very clearly don't want us to be paying attention to, because that limits the applications of their products, basically.
And I mean, it's the same thing. Even they are always proposing this bright future, sometime in the far future, but in the meantime, we all have to lose our jobs and
totally,
and because it's for the greater good in the future.
Yeah, the technology scholar David Noble, who is someone who whose work I find very inspiring for what I do, basically said that we need to look at technology in the present tense, right? These technologies these tech companies are always focused on getting us to look at the future, right? And what these technologies are going to mean for us in this amazing future that they're going to create when self-driving cars are going to be driving everywhere. And we're going to have all these AI helpers, making life better and blah, 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 everything that they promise, right? But the goal of that is to say, don't look at what the technology is doing right now, where they're reducing the power that you have at work, increasing the power of your boss, cutting off access to various social programs, like whatever, all of these negative externalities that are coming of these technologies. Don't pay attention to that, because that's necessary for the great future that we're building. But David Noble said, no, actually, we need to be focused on technology in the present tense, technology in the now, and responding to the real impacts instead of being distracted by what's happening. And that very much kind of inspires what I think about.
Yeah, thank you. And well, I would love to ask many more questions, but I'm sure that all of you have questions as well. And I guess there's even a first one right now.
I would like to ask a question regarding this continuous failure of technology to deliver upon promises that are attached to it. What do you think, to what extent the problem is the intrinsic lack of these technologies, the shortcomings that we do not see, and to what extent the problem is the broader social-political landscape into which these technologies are intertwined? Because as you talked about these failures, then I thought in the history of technology there are similar examples. For example, industrial food production that was very much animated by this vision of delivering food to everyone through increasing output, productivity, etc., etc. We arrive at this paradoxical situation when there is enough food in the world to feed everyone, still people are dying of hunger. And Amartya Sen in 1980s put a very good explanation. He said it's not about it's not about the economic organization, the actual production. It's about entitlement. People do not have access to food, and actually food is being exported from the places where people die out of hunger. So if you agree that there is an important socio-political component to it, then how could we organize technology on this level to use it for progressive purposes and to use its potential that definitely is there, and not to allow it to rather prey on us?
Yeah, it's a really important point. And I think I would answer by saying it's a bit of both, right? On the one hand, you have these people in the tech industry who have this particular philosophy that, all we need is to develop new technologies, and that will make society better. And, they very much believe in the power of technology to deliver all these wondrous futures. And so, they are both, I think, incentivized, but also kind of ideologically predisposed to believe that as long as they kind of are developing new softwares or whatever, society is going to get better. And they are not interested in looking at the potential drawbacks or, the kind of political systems or kind of social systems that would be necessary to actually achieve the potential futures that they say that, that at least they say they want to achieve, right, with the technologies that they're rolling out into the world. But I think on the other part of that, I think that part of the reason that technology can't deliver as well, or that we're getting the wrong technologies, and obviously this is kind of a fraught conversation because our governments are not perfect by any means and have a lot of problems with them, but is also the retreat of the public sector, right? Where when we've been able to roll out technologies and they've made a difference to, our living, governments have often been essential for that, right? If you think about the rollout of sanitation infrastructure and all that kind of stuff, right? That was really essential of having the government doing those things. And I think that by leaving so much of technology and even future thinking and all that kind of stuff to the private sector, that we've lost the ability for the government to think about how technologies can be implemented in such a way that they help the public, or which technologies would actually help us to do that. And how we kind of revive that capacity within the public sector is, of course, a big question. And the degree that we want them to have that capacity is obviously a debate, depending on where you are on the political spectrum and all that kind of stuff. But I think that if we are going to see technology really deliver kind of tangible improvements for people, there's a recognition that needs to be had that it's not just about developing the new technologies, but having the political and social structures that are in place to be able to kind of take them and then use them for the broader public benefit, because just developing the technologies themselves will never kind of do that on their own.
Thank you. Another question, please.
I have a question regarding the gig economy. Anywhere in the world, are there any tries to regulate it by a government anywhere in the world?
Are there any what to regulate it?
Tries.
Yeah. It's a good question, right? We've seen a lot of developments in this direction over the past number of years in particular, because kind of the approach of a lot of governments in the early 2010s, even through to the 2015s, was basically to say, or to kind of accept what the tech industry was saying, that they were technology companies, they were not operating in traditional industries, so they shouldn't, have to follow the rules that generally apply to kind of taxis or whatever else, right? I think increasingly there's a recognition that that was the wrong thing to do in letting the tech industry kind of write their own rules for how labor was going to work on their kind of platforms and whatnot. And so, in the United States, there were attempts to turn these workers, these contract workers, into employees in California in particular. But there was a massive kind of campaign by the gig companies. They spent hundreds of millions of dollars in order to overturn that legislation so that they could keep them as kind of contract workers. You see in the United Kingdom, there is a movement, so they kind of have three classifications of worker. They have contractor, something called like a worker status, which is in between an employee and a contractor, an employee itself. So they've kind of moved it up to the second level, but Uber has still kind of opposed the actual rules that come along with that classification, and it is now going back to the courts to kind of force Uber to carry through. So these companies have a lot of power. We see, of course, at the European Union level, there's movement toward the Platform Work Directive, and there's debates as to what that is going to look like and what it's going to mean, and what it's going to mean for the classification of gig workers across the European Union. Obviously, there's pushes, to ensure that that means that they would be employees, but there's a strong kind of contingent within, I believe it's the European Council or Commission that, would like to see that not happen. In Australia, there's increasing movements toward, turning these workers into employees. Their Senate is, moving a lot of these things forward. I would say one of kind of the standouts to me is Barcelona, where they haven't so much, or, if you look at Spain in general, they have the riders law that was passed last year, I believe, where they've been trying to force these workers to become employees and force these companies to change them over. A lot of them have not been following that. If you look at Barcelona in particular, the taxi unions are very strong there, and they've been successful at keeping Uber out of that entirely, to kind of keep it focused on taxi workers themselves and ensure that they keep the jobs, and that they can kind of that there's still regulations on how that works. So you have the balance of what it means for workers, and so that workers can make a good living, so that, you're considering the traffic impacts and kind of the broader kind of city impacts of the number of vehicles that are on the road, but also you consider, people's accessibility to these types of services and the need to have access to these kind of on-demand services. So yeah, there are movements around. Different places have reached, a different level with it. I would say that Spain's riders law has probably made kind of the most progress in the jurisdictions that I'm aware of.
Thank you. You talked about technology in the present. With regard to sharing, the centre of Prague is hard hit by Airbnb, hard hit by e-scooters. So the idea that this is sharing is now pretty much openly ridiculed. Practically across the political spectrum, which means we're finally getting somewhere with it. But these are things that we're literally tripping up over, these scooters and so on. And you were talking about things in terms of AI that are much, much more hidden. I was shocked at the labour behind ChatGPT, for example. How do we build up that same opposition to these phenomena when we're not tripping up over them every day, and in a society where we unfortunately have a far lesser degree of unionization, for example, than would be ideal?
Yeah, it's a really good question, right? And I think that there are kind of multiple answers to it, or multiple different vectors through which that can happen. I think one of the things, obviously I'm a writer. I, write a lot for various media. I think one of the things that kind of disappoints me is to see how kind of willing a lot of the media that we consume is just to repeat what comes out of the major tech companies, and not to actually kind of criticize and question the narratives that they have and kind of the impacts that the technologies they produce, actually have in society. I think that we have seen kind of a movement where there is some more of that questioning. But I think that if we think about kind of the public understanding of these technologies and the impact of these technologies, the media is a really important role in educating the public on these sorts of things. And unfortunately, we have largely not had that. And so I think that the more that we can kind of push the media in that direction, to be doing those things, to be asking those questions, to be, trying to identify what the technology can actually do rather than just repeating what the tech companies say they can do, is really important to, have that kind of at least base level of knowledge among the public. Then beyond that, I would say that one of the things I've been most heartened by with the rollout of AI over the past year, or, rollout of AI is probably the wrong way to put it, but the hype around generative AI in particular, is to see exactly that unions and kind of creative organizations have responded very strong to, in particular, the image generators. I had the image of the writers' union in the United States, which has been kind of specifically identifying how AI was a threat to their profession if the Hollywood studios determined how it could roll out and how it could be used to alter the work that they do, right? And they very clearly looked for regulations in their contracts to kind of regulate and decide how these technologies would be used in their kind of sector. But of course, not every sector has a union like that can actually do those sorts of things. And so then, of course, we also see among authors who aren't unionized and don't kind of, how would I put it, don't negotiate a contract directly with publishers in, a collective kind of bargaining arrangement every however many years, that they have turned to the courts to try to get some sort of regulation or some sort of court decision on the use of these technologies and what they actually mean. You've obviously seen a lot of prominent people who are involved in these campaigns, who are kind of public figures, who are recognizable to a lot of the public, speaking out to kind of try to educate the people who care about their work as to what this actually means. And I think that another vector, I would say, for that kind of education and for that kind of work is just collective organizations more generally, right? If it's not a labor union that can't kind of, negotiate a particular contract, maybe it's different kind of organizations within the public, like, an authors guild or like an illustrators kind of, people who represent illustrators and things like that, but also other types of groups in society who are interested in human rights, who are interested in, discrimination and stopping discrimination against various groups, migrant organizations, things like that, to think about the ways that these technologies can be rolled out, in the various kind of systems that the people they represent depend on. So I think that there are multiple vectors there, but it's about having, that degree of education. It's about, wanting to kind of put the resources into that. So it's not to say it's easy, but it's kind of diffuse work that needs to be done. Yeah.
Another question?
Hello. I wanted to touch a little bit the aspect of universality and cultural aspects of the AI, because I remember I attended a lecture here several years ago. I think it's 5, 6, maybe Teresa can help. And there was an amazing Polish lady who back then talked about the prospect of the self-driven cars. But she said that it's put on hold back then because it was not possible to reach universal conclusion on the casualties. Because in some cultures, if the car knows that there's going to be an accident, and the cars need to evaluate whom to kill if needed. And some cultures would say, go and kill young mother with a child. And some cultures would say, don't do this. Go and kill some old people because they have lived long enough. And it was extremely interesting for me, and also listening to you now, is AI is not, or the perception of AI would probably not be universal in all the cultures. How is that dealt with? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question, right? How to approach it, basically. I think on the self-driving question, I think that this kind of, we often call it like the trolley question, right? Or, this question of kind of, if, you're facing a baby and a mother, which one is it going to run over or whatnot? These are difficult questions, but I think that inherently, actually, the problem was not so much those questions, but that the technology was not actually as powerful or as advanced as we were thinking based on what the companies were saying, right? And so I think that actually it was a bit of a misdirection to focus on these kind of bigger questions and not, can this technology actually work in the way that we would expect it? But that's not to say that these aren't important things to consider, especially when, we have generative AI tools that can kind of churn out images and whatnot and writing. And then the question is, should we be allowing them to do this? Should we want this to happen? Should we be thinking, as to how we want these technologies to be used instead of just letting them be used in any kind of different venue? Certainly there is kind of the cultural aspect, as you say, different societies may make different choices as to what they're ready to accept on that. And I think that that is kind of perfectly fine, because we often assume that just because a technology exists, it's going to be the same absolutely everywhere, and there's no way that we can kind of shape it in our own environment. I actually don't think that's the case, and I think that more and more we're learning that there can be kind of distinctions, and there can be different rules, and there can be different ways that things operate in different jurisdictions if we choose to do that. In Canada right now, we have regulations that are being adopted on the streaming services to kind of force them to show a certain amount of Canadian content to people, right? And the streaming services went mad and were very angry about the fact that that very small expectation will be placed on them, right? But I think that there are ways that we can shape how these technologies are ultimately working. I think that when it comes to AI, it's still entirely possible. And, for example, if you think about the writers and actors kind of going on strike and thinking about how AI is going to be used in their professions, again, that's them kind of saying, this is not acceptable to us for it to be used in this way. And I think that you have a lot of people on their side who understand that it shouldn't be used in that way, right? And that's not to say that there's no uses of AI that are potentially acceptable or that might be useful. But I think that we need to be able to have these conversations as to how they're being rolled out, what makes sense in different societies, parts of the world, or what have you, and then coming to those determinations kind of collectively instead of letting the tech companies make those decisions for us, because I think we're ultimately probably not going to agree with what they decide.
So yeah, we have another question here in front.
Dobrý den. Vidíte vy osobně na rozvoji umělé inteligence také něco pozitivního? Děkuji.
Do you see anything positive about the development of AI?
Good question. That one is difficult for me, I think, because I do take the perspective of a critic. And so my focus is definitely on the more negative side of these technologies and the potential drawbacks that come of them, because I think that there is too much focus on the positive aspects of it, right? And kind of overstating those things. And so I feel if I'm a bit too much of a pessimist, that's okay, because it's kind of pushing back against all of the optimism that's out there, right? I don't think all of these implementations of these technologies are inherently bad. Like if you think about the autocorrect on your phone, that is AI as well. And, that is perfectly fine. I guess it can shape how we think about language and things like that. Maybe there are broader discussions to have there, but I don't think it's like an inherently terrible thing. I'm very conflicted on like the chat GPTs and the image generators and whatnot, and whether we should be using them and kind of what role that they should actually have in, helping people to prepare written work or helping people to kind of, think about different kind of ways of presenting visual styles or thinking about how to kind of put artworks together. So I would say I don't really have a full answer. Like personally, I don't use them, and I'm quite against them. And I don't see kind of the positive use cases there. But I know that not everyone is the same. And so that is, I think, why there needs to be that more collective discussion where we understand what the technologies are doing so that we can decide kind of what we're okay with, what people in different industries are okay with these technologies being used for in their professions. So that we can come to terms with that. But then I also think, and one thing that I'm very opposed to is the use of these AI technologies, as I was talking about, if we're thinking about judgment versus calculation, is to roll out these technologies in the deployment of kind of key services that people depend on and things like that. I'm very firmly against kind of the use of these in immigration systems, in policing systems, in social welfare systems, in healthcare systems, all this sort of stuff, because I think that ultimately, the technologies can be used for ill in those cases, and I think time and again see how people who are in more powerful positions are able to point to the technologies and to say, the algorithm said this is okay, so we just need to go with that. And I think that there's a lot of problems there. So it's probably not a full answer to your question. I probably can't say so much the ways where I'm okay with the technologies, because I'm quite conflicted on them and quite opposed to them, if we're being honest.
Maybe I will just chip in here. Can you name any single example of AI technology that you consider to be good, to be working for public good? I mean, for example, for me, it's translation, automatic translation, like Google Translate. Of course, many things in there are extremely problematic. It is also taking work apart from translators and other people, and it's owned by an evil company and so on. But still, it's the useful technology. It works for something good. do you have any examples of your own?
Yeah, I definitely use translation tools sometimes, right? And of course, I make a podcast, and if there weren't kind of audio to text AI tools, we probably wouldn't have transcriptions available because it would be cost prohibitive. It'd be too expensive to do it. And so the system we have set up is that we use the AI tool to kind of create an initial transcript of the podcast, and then I have an actual human worker who goes through and fixes all the problems that the AI puts in there, because it's actually not very good, but it probably saves her like an hour or two total in putting it together. But yeah, I would say I have difficulty with it in general. Yeah.
Okay, so another question, because we are coming to the finish. So please, no question at all. There's one. Okay, so please.
Thank you. Hi, Parix. And Matouš. Since you have shared the slide with us regarding those AI ups and downs in the years, and also AI wintertime, what's your take on the AI in about 50 years? Do you have any vision how it could evolve?
Not particularly. I think it will be able to do a bit more than it does today, because ultimately computing power will increase. I don't think we're going to have like an artificial general intelligence where computers are going to replicate human intelligence or anything like that. I think in general what we see is that computing power increases over time, that the computers are able to do more and more. But I would hesitate to kind of sit here and talk to you about all of the kind of great and wonderful things that AI is going to produce for us in 50 years, because I think that if you look back to 70 years ago, actually what you see, and if you look at kind of the promises that were made over time, is that there's often a lot of promises about how transformative these technologies are going to be. And certainly they do progress. Certainly they do have new capabilities over time, but the kind of revolution that is often predicted is not actually there. You said I wrote a book about self-driving cars and transportation more broadly. You can go back to like the early 1900s and people were saying that self-driving cars were, a couple decades away, and then you go to the 50s and they were saying it, and then you go to the 70s and they were saying it, and then you go to the 90s and they were saying it. And these kind of promises constantly with these technologies are made over and over again. And I think that one of the problems that we have is that often when we think about technologies and when we talk about technologies, and I think that the industry is very much incentivized to ensure that this happens, is that we don't have much actual historical perspective on those technologies. So when the tech industry says self-driving cars are going to change everything, or AI is going to change everything, actually we could look back and see that, various companies have promised these same things multiple times in the past and not delivered on them. But not having that historical knowledge works for Silicon Valley and the tech companies elsewhere in the world, so that we can't actually say, hold on now, actually we've been promised this many times and it hasn't been delivered. And so why should we believe you this time? So yeah, I'm sure that AI will be more powerful in 50 years. But will it make the world a much better place and, make everything great and wonderful? I don't think so. I think that it'll take more work than just better AI to deliver something like that.
So, thank you for your questions and your answers. We are running out of time, but before we finished, the organizers have asked me to sum up 3 most important conclusions of this discussion at the end, and it's hard. So I will ask you to help me. So I will start. Probably my first conclusion would be that we should think about the language that we used in the discussion about AI and who is saying what and for what reason. So that would be my first conclusion.
I like that one.
Can you help me with another?
Sure. I think I would say, one of my takeaways is to think about, what the technologies can actually do, and then thinking about, just because they can do something, should they actually do it? And how we actually come to these kind of collective decisions as to how technology is being rolled out, instead of leaving it to the tech companies in the private sector to make those decisions themselves on behalf of the rest of us.
And we need one last conclusion. So what would that be?
ChatGPT is not the first chatbot.
That's very, I think we can say that we should think about the history of technologies, because it tells us a lot. Yeah. So thank you. That was Parix Marx.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
That's all for today. In our next special, which will be in Czech, you will hear social anthropologist Markéta Zandlová, a hydrologist Václav Hradílek, and environmentalist Vlastimil Karlík discuss the problem of drought in the Czech Republic. You can listen to all screenshot episodes at inspiracniforum.com/podcasts and in all podcast hosting apps.